to welcome you all to the 2024 Corcoran Chair Conference, sponsored by the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. I'm Dr. Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski, the Kraft Family Professor of Jewish-Christian Relations and the Director of the Center. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Professor Jonathan Decter over this academic year in his capacity as our visiting professor to plan this year's conference on the theme of ranking religions, taxonomic comparison in medieval Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thought. Professor Decter has built a distinguished career examining the questions and themes of this conference. The presence of all of you, experts in your own right on this topic, indicates the vibrancy and relevance of the theme of ranking religions in the current endeavor to better understand the diverse religious landscape of the pre-modern world. The work of this conference over the next 2 days invites us to sit with the range of possible encounters between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. We will be able to attend to their relative judgments of one another and what conclusions we might draw from these various depictions and reflections. It's my hope that we can carefully and collectively work to listen both to the past and to one another amid the positive, the negative, and the ambivalent that might surface. I'm very grateful to all of our presenters and panelists and presiders who've taken time to engage in this work. Likewise, I offer welcome to those of us who've joined us in the audience, in person, and online. And especially to Dr. Camille Markey, Associate Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. I'm especially grateful for her careful preparation for this conference. I'm now happy to turn our proceedings over to Dr. Jonathan Decter. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Very good to see you all. Let's go back to. So first, thank you very much, Dan, for this kind introduction, and more broadly for hosting me so warmly over the course of the year here at BC. Also, thank you to the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College, and again to Camille Fitzpatrick Markey, the Associate Director, and also for all of her work in this on this conference in particular. And thank you also to the Department of Theology. Over the course of the year, I've become very fond of chatting with everybody who works in Stokes Hall and with others across the Boston College community, including its students. I know that these encounters have led to new knowledge and insight that has broadened my horizons and enriched my own work. I now consider BC to be an academic home away from home that's actually closer to where I live than my usual academic home. I walk here, I have to drive to Brandeis University, so that's also been very special. One programmatic change to be announced is that Alicia Russ-Fishbane could not make it, so we're going to have only 3 talks today on the first panel instead of 4. Since I've tried to include Jewish, Islamic, and Christian materials on every panel, that leaves us without a Jewish studies talk or Jewish source-based talk on the first panel. So I'm going to expand my remarks a little bit in this opening address to cover 10th century Jewish thought. And then instead of taking a break in the middle of the first panel, we're going to take a break right after I talk for probably about 20 minutes or so. And then we're going to start the panel at 3 and then go straight through until 5:15, whenever it ends. Okay, so my research over the past several years has been occupied with the question of when Jews came to recognize themselves as possessing a religion or adhering to religion, and that this was a species of a broader genus, a species that could be compared with others in that same genus. Now, to some, that question sounds absolutely ridiculous. Of course, Judaism must have been a religion ever since there were Jews, but has been argued by scholars, including Leora Botnitsky and Daniel Boyarin, such an assumption cannot be taken for granted. For Botnitsky, Judaism became a religion only in the 19th century, when Jews came to see their commitments as a matter of personal choice an interior experience that was divorced from communal authority. Boyarin also argues that up until the 19th century, Jews saw themselves as an ethnos that did not recognize an abstract entity, an ism, if you will, that was comprised of doctrines, rituals, moral injunctions, laws, eschatology, and exegetical practices, the things that we usually think of as making up the entity called religion. So in my own work, I've argued that medieval Arabic-speaking Jews internalized a comparative framework wherein they viewed themselves as possessing or adhering to an entity that they alternatively called Din al-Yahud, roughly the religion of the Jews, or al-Yahudiya, roughly Judaism, and that this was a species of a genus that could in fact be compared with other species of the same genus, Din al-Nasara, the Din of the Christians, or al-Islam. And this is a genus that we generally recognize as being closely related to the category of religion, if not identical to it. So of course the question of when Judaism became a religion is bound up with the larger question of when religion emerged as a category at all, or what it is in the first place. Some have pointed to the 19th century, when the science of religion came into existence, and stressed that imposing the categories of religious studies, which are essentially Christian categories, on non-Christian groups, whether pre-modern or modern, is not only inaccurate, but complicit in furthering the effects of the colonialist paradigms from which the field sprouted. Others, such as Jonathan Z. Smith, have pointed to the 16th century as a watershed moment, specifically that Europe's imperial encounter with the Americas required the integration and categorization of masses of new data about the beliefs and practices of human groups, and hence the idea of a plurality of religions emerged. Guy Stromze also emphasizes the 16th century as a turning point, goaded by missionary activities in the Americas and in Asia, but also driven by attendant epistemological shifts. And these allowed for new taxonomies of groups to emerge. In his view, a demand for a single approach to studying all religions and growing skepticism toward Christianity allowed for a reconfiguration of perceived hierarchies. Whereas a medieval person would have grouped Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together on one side of a divide, everything else belonged on the other side. But by the 18th century, a host of new and more intricate taxonomies were introduced. While these were not devoid of polemical agendas, Stromze shows that the early modern discourse on religion is also not without empathy or genuine curiosity. In addition, Carlo Ginzburg describes his own work as, quote, dedicated to the emergence between the 15th and 17th centuries of a comparative approach to religions, an approach far older than the late 19th century codification of the history of religion as an academic discipline. Older, yes, but how much older? And that's where his quote ends. Arguments have been made that push the emergence for a comparative framework earlier still, to the Middle Ages and late antiquity, and also beyond the confines of European thought. Jeremy Schott, for example, argues that, quote, early Christian apologetic discourse represents a mode of comparative practice analogous to, and in some ways the basis for, early modern and modern discourses of comparative religion. In recent work, Rashan Abbasi has also argued that in the medieval Islamic world, the religious existed as a sphere that was distinct from and complementary to the secular. Moreover, he argues post-colonial scholars who have viewed religion as an early modern or modern category only have failed to take data from the Islamic world into account, and ironically maintain a myopically Eurocentric view of the field. And a number of people in this room are familiar with the great works on religions that were compiled in the Islamic world according to various different hierarchies by authors such as Ash-Shahrastani or Ibn Hazm, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, even some early works that are lost, but we know by their titles must have been surveys of different doctrinal groups, such as Abu Isa al-Warraq, who wrote a work called Kitab al-Maqalat, the book of confessions, probably. It's probably what that work meant. And it seemed to have been rather broad in its scope. So For the present conference, I hope to delve further into such comparative practices. So rather than getting caught up in the questions of exactly how we should define religion and whether it existed in the pre-modern period, I suggest instead that we focus on comparative practices themselves and broad conceptualization over time. How did Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the medieval period account for the plurality of beliefs, practices, and orientations toward God? How did they imagine other religious groups came into existence? How did they think that the beliefs and practices spread or evolved on a social or political level? What did they think could be learned by studying or encountering groups distant from one's own? Whatever epistemic shifts may have taken place across different periods, we can document a degree of continuity with respect to comparative practices, as well as data, and so we might investigate the precise relationship between pre-modern and modern modes of comparison. We will study one key aspect of medieval comparative practices, namely the ways in which medieval Muslims, Christians, and Jews created taxonomies of religious groups, how they categorized them and imagined them in relation to one another, and whether and when they arrayed them in graduated hierarchies. So at the root, we can ask what is being accomplished or performed when a religious group asks of another, are they like us or not like us? Are they more like us or less like us than some other group? Since they are definitely inferior to us, what exactly is it about them that makes them inferior? By witnessing how medieval thinkers thought through these problems, we may gain a greater understanding of how they conceived of themselves and refine their very sense of us. Medieval interreligious encounters were overwhelmingly polemical. Even the most cordial were predicated on deep differences in doctrine and related rituals. Therefore, in all of the texts that will be discussed, I believe we can presume that the inquiry was at least partly intended to vindicate the claims of one tradition over those of another. David Friedenreich, who's happily with us today, has shown recently that Christian writings that lump Jews and Christians as closely related or wholly indistinguishable from each other serve polemical purposes through rhetorical means, ultimately in the service of advancing Christian truth claims. It therefore might be tempting to draw a fast distinction that labels medieval taxonomies as polemical and modern ones as scientific or objective. However, anyone who's taken an introductory course in religious studies should know that the issue of the modern taxonomy of religions is also deeply fraught. Should they be divided into Eastern and Western, monotheistic and polytheistic, idolatrous and non-idolatrous, scriptural versus non-scriptural, law-based versus ethics-based, prophetic or wisdom-based, the very dated primitive versus abstract, or the one that's currently used in my kids' public school curriculum on world religions, universalizing versus ethnic? It's very interesting. In case you're wondering, the correct answer on the multiple choice exam is that Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism fall on the universalizing side. Judaism and Hinduism are on the other side, along with everything else. So just in case you find yourself with that exam in front of you, you'll know how to get the answer right. Tomoko Masuzawa has stressed that claims of Western supremacy can lurk even behind such seemingly innocuous 19th century categorizations as the great religions and world religions. Therefore, polemical versus objective does not quite hold as a distinguishing feature between medieval and modern discourses. Conversely, although intended polemically, medieval authors sometimes portray a surprising amount of empathy toward religious others, as well as critical distance concerning their own traditions. The act of comparison actually seems to have left some intellectuals hard-pressed to show precisely what made their tradition different and superior. So my hope in this conference is to look closely at medieval taxonomies, whether they're explicit or implicit, to contemplate the underlying principles of comparison and the shifting grounds of comparison among thinkers and even in the thought of individual thinkers. While it might seem that a principle of comparison, such as prophetology or monotheism versus polytheism, must precede the comparison itself, it can also be the case that a principle emerges or gains centrality through the very act of comparison. Hence, it's worth considering when an author foregrounds one element of comparison over another, doctrine, ritual, ethics, eschatology, scripture, and so forth. And we should think about the effect that this ultimately has on one's representation of others and ultimately of oneself. In general, it seems that medieval authors select principles of comparison that favor the truth claims of their own community. So Jews tend to prioritize prophetology, partly because they thought that the prophethood of Jesus and Muhammad could be challenged on logical grounds. Muslims often stress revelatory books because they thought that the Quran's perfection could be proved, while the contradictions in the Torah and the New Testament were self-evident. Christians often prioritize eschatology and salvation because Jewish views on the subject seem somewhat muddled, and because the Quranic depiction of paradise could easily be maligned as sensual when read literally. At the same time, within each community, and even for individual thinkers, the grounds of comparison could be unstable and shifting. So in this conference, I'm coming in with a few questions, and I'm hoping that all of you can help me think through them. One, why do authors select the taxonomic strategies that they do? And why is a particular element of comparison foregrounded? Two, to what extent can we call taxonomic practice a shared mode of thought for Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the medieval period? How does the taxonomic thinking of one group impact that of another? Three, insofar as there are always polemical overtones involved in pre-modern taxonomies, are there also elements that counterbalance polemical tendencies, or that can be characterized as products of empathy or simple curiosity? And four, to what degree do comparative practices reflect or generate conceptions of a multifaceted broad entity, a genus, whether this genus should be given the name religion or not? So in my own work, I am studying the ways in which medieval Islamic taxonomies left an imprint on the writings of Arabic-speaking Jews in Iraq, Egypt, and Spain. So whereas rabbinic writing from late antiquity generally presents a simple dichotomy that places Jews on one side and everyone else on the other, Jewish thought in the medieval Islamic world reveals a far more diverse set of taxonomies that varies from thinker to thinker and within the thought of individual thinkers. While there are a good number of articles with titles such as so-and-so's attitude toward Islam or so-and-so's attitude toward Christianity, I'm trying to move away from the attitudes toward question and ask a higher order question, a higher order of conceptualization about how Jewish thinkers imagined a broad landscape of religious groups, one that was not limited to Muslims and Christians, as well as how they perceived the interrelation among these groups. Tomorrow, I will speak about Judah Halevi from 12th century Al-Andalus. But for now, just let me make the subject of the conference a bit more concrete, especially for the uninitiated, with a couple of examples taken from Jewish authors of the 10th century. So by this time, the expansion of Islamic empires had placed Muslims in close contact with the beliefs and practices of peoples throughout its vast territories and on its borders. Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, Hindus, Buddhists, and so forth, as well as a panoply of ancient texts. Muslims wrote works that brought the similarities and differences among groups into bold relief, actually. So much so that Louis Massignon, the great Catholic scholar of Islam, described comparative religion as an invention of the medieval Islamic world. Although the impulse to categorize may have begun with administrative needs, such as the collection of taxes, there soon emerged a discourse about other religions that was thorough and sometimes empathetic, even amidst polemical agendas. Taxonomies included distinguishing muwahhidun, those who professed God's unity, from mushrikun, those who ascribe partners to God, sometimes called associators, basically the Quran's term for polytheists. Or they could draw distinctions between kafirun, those who hold false beliefs or misbelief, from mu'minin or mu'minun, believers, those who hold proper belief. Or they could distinguish those who possess sacred books from those who lack them. And in between, there could be a category of people who have books that are like sacred books, but not exactly on the same level as sacred books. And there are many other systems as well. So And in subsequent centuries, this discourse just became more elaborate and more sophisticated. And there's a genre of writing in Arabic, for people who don't know, called the milal wa nihal genre, the genre of, let's say, religious communities, milal, and sects, in the sense of not necessarily of subgroups of an overarching group, but they can sometimes just be groups of a different type than the milal. Sometimes they seem to be of an inferior status, but that varies from author to author. Okay, so although Sa'ad Gaon, the towering Jewish figure of 10th century Iraq, never wrote a systematic work on other religions, at numerous points in his writings, he reveals perceptions of taxonomy and hierarchy. The most simple of these, I'd say, is the one he presents in his commentary on chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, where the prophet interprets a dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. So the king had a famous dream about a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. The metals are identified by Daniel already as successive kingdoms. Sa'adi interprets the feet of iron and clay as a composite kingdom, the most recent one, comprising Christians and Muslims together, though he goes on to discuss the diverse effects of each community on its subject populations, and particularly how changes in political rule can affect the deen, basically the religion and the set of practices of religious communities that come to live within their political borders. So he then asks why all of these kingdoms, given that these are all different kingdoms, why all of these kingdoms are represented by a single statue, which he calls an idol. Why aren't they represented by individual statues? And he answers, it is all a single subjugation. Similarly, in the Torah, Israel's enemies are named in the singular, your enemy, in Deuteronomy. Hence, for political purposes at least, Sa'ad's taxonomy is like that of the rabbis, with Jews on one side and everyone else on the other. But next, let us consider his commentary on Proverbs chapter 24, verse 21. So the verse reads, my child, fear the Lord and the king, and do not mix with shonim. The Hebrew word shonim coming from basic sense of change. So it's sometimes translated as dissenters or those who are given to change. But Sa'adja tellingly translates this word shonim as mushrikun, those who ascribe partners to God, the classic Islamic term for polytheism. So for Sa'adja, this is an overarching group within which several doctrinal schools are housed. And he writes, they worship us like they worship two, like the dualists, or they believe in the eternity of the world, like the people of primordial matter, or they divide him into three parts, like the Christians, or they claim that the conductors of the world are 7 or 12, like the Sabians, or more, like the materialists. Islam does not appear within this category, which suggests a general bifurcation wherein Jews and Muslims, and possibly others, fall on one side as those who profess the unity of God, muwahidun, and the mushrikun on the other. Christians fall on the side of the mushrikun, as they are often categorized in Islamic polemical works from the period. A more refined hierarchy is evident in Sa'ad's commentary on chapter 9 of Proverbs. The chapter draws a distinction between wisdom, which is figured as a woman who prepared a table to which he invites the unlearned to eat, and the foolish woman who sits idly at the entry of her house without preparing a meal, but nonetheless beckons wayfarers to come and eat. Sa'adja reads the passage as a discourse comparing those who speak truthfully, the muhikun, and those who speak falsely, the mubtilun. And these are the speakers among, quote, members of doctrinal schools or religions, ashab al-madhahib. So each invites people to follow the profession of their own doctrine. And he writes, the truth tellers are those who profess unity, al-muwahidun, who adduced evidence that the material substances are created, after having explained that there is such a thing as truth, which contemplation reveals and clarifies. Then they refute the materialists, then the dualists, then the Trinitarians, then the remaining categories of heretics. Only then do they invite the people to their doctrine. As for the liars, they do the opposite of these things, and despite this, invite the people. Such is the matter with all of the heretics concerning worshiping idols, statues, and other things. And so it is also with all those who feign ignorance and the materialists. They are not concerned with seeking wisdom at all. Rather, their aim is only to present specious arguments to gullible or stupid, or to a gullible or stupid person. So the doctrinally differentiated groups are arranged hierarchically, starting with the most distant from the truth, those who feign ignorance. Their arguments are wholly specious, then the materialists, the dualists, and finally the Trinitarians. Muslims are again absent from the list, which suggests that they should be included among the professors of unity, or they could simply be off the map entirely. So for Saadia, taxonomy shifts depending on whether he is thinking about politics or doctrine. I'd say he is focused more on doctrinal positions than religions per se, but even these groups he sees as adhering to corresponding rituals. When one group ascends politically over another, he stresses that the deen of the subject population, at least its external aspects, can be eradicated or replaced. Finally, I just want to point to one other author very briefly, who gives us yet a different type of taxonomy, and this is Yafet Ben Eli, a famous Karaite commentator from around the year 1000. And he wrote in his commentary on Psalm 139 something very telling. So the psalm simply reads, "Surely, O God, you will slay the wicked, men of blood away from me. For they speak of you not, your enemies swear by you falsely. Lord, you know I hate those that hate you and loathe those who defy you. I feel a perfect hatred toward them. I count them my enemies." So the delineation of God's adversaries provided Yefet with a convenient node to consider who was who. According to Yefet, the psalmist divides the nations into two, the latter of which further divides into two parts. So first, you have those who believe in the Creator and a revealed law. In our time, they are the people of the Quran and the Injil, or the New Testament. These are meant, in his words, wicked men of blood, your enemies who swear by you falsely. Sorry. In the second category, those who hate you include materialists and idolaters, while those who defy you are the Barahima, who deny revelation. And don't ask me who the Barahima are. That's what they're. They're people who deny revelation. To be sure, God doesn't particularly like any of these groups, and the Jews are clearly separate from them all. But what interests me here is the internalization of a thoroughly Islamicized taxonomy. Grouping Christianity and Islam together closely mirrors the Islamic concept of people of the book, and the further divisions of materialists, idolaters, and Brahmins also capture the structural accounting system of belief and practice that was developing in Islamic writing. So although doctrine is most central to the passage, Yefet goes on to delineate the wayward rituals of the latter groups. I hope these examples make the subject of the conference a little bit more concrete. There are different types of conferences, right? So there's one kind of conference where an organizer pitches a very broad topic, let's say Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle Ages, and then invites people that they know to come and talk about whatever it is they happen to be working on. Then there are types of conferences where the organizer comes up with something that's very narrow that pertains to their own research and basically asks a lot of very good people to come to humor them and to indulge them and to give papers on the topic that they asked them to talk about. This conference is certainly of the latter type, and I'm very grateful to all of you for agreeing to participate and to indulge me. So really, very sincerely, I appreciate your writing this and for coming in. And I look forward to learning from you all. So finally, again, I wish to thank Dan, whose last name is truly ineffable, and whose students just call him Professor J.S., so I'm going with that as well. Again, I also wish to thank Camille for extraordinary work in organizing this conference. We were trying to come up with a dramatic way of concluding the conference. I first thought of fireworks, and Camille said, no, it's going to be in the middle of the day. It's too bright. Why don't we try a solar eclipse instead? So we went with the eclipse. Because of budgetary constraints, we are not getting 100% totality, but we did. The center generously paid for 90% obscurity of the sun. That will begin immediately following the conclusion of the conference. We're going to have solar eclipse glasses for a good number of solar eclipse glasses that we can share if we don't have enough. So without further ado, I'd like to take a little bit of a break. No Q&A from the opening address. You can harass me over coffee if you like. And we're going to start with the panel at 3 o'clock. Okay. Thank you.